When Final Fantasy XII was released back in 2006, it presented a bold new direction for the franchise. But even though the game was visibly successful, receiving rave reviews from critics around the world and selling more than 6 million copies, it was ultimately a title that faced many difficulties. The long, tumultuous development cycle Final Fantasy XII endured is well documented, and its numerous delays would end up having far-reaching consequences, not least because it saw the game release right at the end of the PlayStation 2's lifecycle, just before the PlayStation 3 would emerge and steal the spotlight. But even though back then it was painful for fans and the actual developers working on the game, with hindsight, it means there are tons of interesting stories to tell, and there are still a ton of interesting morsels to be found within the game itself. So, for today's video, it's why we are still excited to dive into them, as we explore another array of facts related to Final Fantasy XII that we are confident you still didn't know. So strap yourselves in as we venture further into some of the game's more unique trivia, starting with its very own Commemoration Day. Over the years, it hasn't been too uncommon for Square Enix to host events to promote and celebrate impending launches. While these are often seen to be far more abundant and usually on a larger scale in Japan, there have been numerous special events taking place in North America and Europe. Some examples include the Crisis Core launch event, which took place in the PlayStation Store at the San Francisco Metreon in 2008, and more recently, the Uncovered Final Fantasy XV promotional event in Los Angeles back in 2016. These events would often feature a slew of activities, limited edition merchandise, and a few guest appearances from high-profile figures from the company and beyond. And Final Fantasy XII was the recipient of one such event in the build-up to the release of the game. This commemorative event took place in New York City on the 11th of October 2006. But what made it rather special in comparison to other events was that New York City itself, via its tourism organization, officially declared the 11th of October 2006 as Final Fantasy XII Day. The day started off at 11:30 AM with a ceremony in Times Square. It featured the likes of Akitoshi Kawazu, the executive producer of Final Fantasy XII, and Square Enix North America's COO, Daishiro Akada. Square Enix also revealed the winners of their cosplay contest, which had been running from the 12th of September through to the 29th. The 3 winners received a free trip to New York City to attend the festivities, and were even invited to showcase their outfits. Other events that day included a press conference, there being a life-sized Judge Magister, and street team members roaming around Manhattan to hand out what they described as limited edition Final Fantasy XII tchotchkes. The event would serve as a huge promotional activity for the game in North America, where it was released soon after. And although similar commemorative events for other games would follow, no other game would ever have the distinction of having a North American city officially commemorate a day to honour its release. Now, it's no secret that Final Fantasy XII was quite large in scale in comparison to previous mainline games. With such intricate gameplay mechanics and a large amount of side content for players to engage in, its sheer volume pushed the limits of the PlayStation 2 platform in ways very few other games ever had. But one of the most interesting factors regarding its size would be the number of NPCs found within the game and how much it was increased by comparison. Square Enix took part in GDC 2007 with Taku Murata, a game programming supervisor in Final Fantasy XII, conducting a post-mortem which talked in detail about what they were looking to accomplish. It covered numerous topics, but one of the most intriguing was that Final Fantasy XII featured a whopping 1,000 unique NPCs, 5 times the number of NPCs found in Final Fantasy X, which came to just over 200. Murata would also present a diagram showing that due to their shift in focus towards creating such an enormous world, roughly 70% of their resourcing budget was assigned to artwork, as opposed to game design and programming, very different from previous games. The massive volume of NPCs, as well as 250 different monsters and 30 bosses, would ultimately present some developmental struggles due to the PlayStation 2's limited memory capacity when combined with the huge low processing of the game's battle system. Murata went on to share that the team expected the game's development time to increase as a result of the inclusion of these factors, which ultimately did occur as the game notoriously released much later than initially planned. Continuing on with the same theme, the world of Final Fantasy XII would end up being made the home of an assortment of interesting races and creatures, including the Bangar, Mughals, Viera, and the Espers. But perhaps some of the most interesting and mysterious beings were none other than the Ikuria. Depicted as mystical and spectre-like beings, the Ikuria were positioned as the most powerful beings in Final Fantasy XII. They would ultimately preside over Ivalice, continuing to influence its history by manipulating various power players. Vinar, the game's secondary antagonist, was also a member of this race, although they would have different motivations. But even though the Ikuria were positioned as deity-like beings, their original concept was actually quite different. According to the Final Fantasy XII Ultimania Omega, the Ikuria were initially created to be a race of mind flayers. Early concept art would depict them as wearing extravagant robes and lounging around in an ornate bar setting. This could suggest that they were meant to resemble the other common races of Ivalice to some extent, like the Viera or Mughals. However, over time, their design would ultimately be revised to its current shrouded form, with their original concept being reworked into the Mind Flayer enemy mark instead. As an interesting aside, some of the Ikuria's current design elements would end up being eerily reminiscent of Black Mages in Final Fantasy IX. Both beings would have faces that were almost entirely obscured, save for a pair of glowing eyes. The Ikuria, in their physical form, would also give off excess amounts of mist, and in Final Fantasy IX, the Black Mages were created from mist. Whether or not the correlation between these two beings means something is largely up to speculation, but there's certainly interesting points of comparison. Dummied content exists within most Final Fantasy games, and most often, it consists of unused or scrapped ideas. Final Fantasy XII would be no exception to this, having its own slew of dummied content, but one piece in particular was rather curious: the Hero's Blade. As part of the game's promotional campaign, Square Enix produced official CGI artwork renders for the various characters, including Ash, and in her picture, she was holding a rather awesome looking sword, which we would later learn was called the Hero's Blade. This sword would also appear in the opening FMV of Final Fantasy XII when King Ramenas was seen bestowing it upon Prince Rassler before his departure for war. In Rassler's official CG render, he would also be shown holding this particular sword within its scabbard. But even though the sword was presented with so much importance, it would be unattainable in the game itself, having been dummied out. What's interesting is that the dummied Hero's Blade would retain interesting properties that otherwise implied that it was, at some point, supposed to be obtainable and usable in the game. Some of these would include its attack stat of 15, its own menu picture, and even a unique sound that resonated upon hitting foes. Considering its frequent depiction in the possession of the Dalmascan royal family and Prince Rassler, as well as its relatively low attack stat, this may have suggested that the Hero's Blade could have been, at one point, a default weapon for Ash. However, this remains purely speculation. Now, sticking with the subject of dummied materials, some other content included a fully coloured in-game render of Rassler, who was only seen as a discoloured render in his apparition form. There was also a prisoner model variant of Balthier, which really just looks like a head replacement for a normal prisoner NPC. When Final Fantasy XII was initially released, Square Enix were more than comfortable with the idea of creating polymorphic content. And so, to provide additional entertainment for fans, they decided to create a manga adaptation that would end up being comprised of 19 chapters and 5 book volumes. Though it was essentially a retelling of the main story of the game, the manga series would expand the universe and give more backstory to its characters. This would see much more focus placed on the events leading up to Princess Ash's engagement to Prince Rassler, as well as showing how Bash obtained the large scar on his forehead. Unfortunately, despite running from December 2006 through to August 2009, the manga was cancelled before reaching a proper conclusion. It's never been disclosed as to why it ended so abruptly, but there has been plenty of speculation. For one, the manga was known for introducing darker elements within the original story, depicting more gruesome imagery, as well as some story details that were nothing short of disturbing. It's believed that these mature and darker themes contributed to the manga's demise, especially when thinking about the original game's lower age rating. But some might view the pushing of boundaries as intriguing elements that ultimately helped to flesh out the story further. Perhaps one of the most sinister yet insightful details to be revealed in the manga related to the grisly nature of Rex's death. But going even further, right at the end of the series, Ash even lost her forearm owing to the bond she had with Belias. Pretty crazy stuff, but as the book was cancelled, we never got to see how it concluded. Even though much of Final Fantasy XII was well received by players and audiences, there were still some areas of the game that received mixed reviews, and one such area would be none other than the game's main protagonist, Vaughn. Much has been said over the years about how the game's director, Yasumi Matsuno, wanted Final Fantasy XII to have a much more rugged main protagonist, someone in the mold of Ashley Riot, the main protagonist of Vagrant Story. But there was a feeling outside of Matsuno that Final Fantasy fans would not resonate with such a protagonist, so Vaughn was created as the last member of the ensemble cast and thrust into the leading role in favour of Basch von Ronsenberg. Compared to other characters, Vaughn was not as heavily involved with the main plot, instead acting more as an observer. Though it was understood what the development team were trying to achieve in making Vaughn the main protagonist, it was a decision met with criticism and mixed feelings from audiences, as he was often seen to be unimportant and, in more harsher claims, useless. But not everyone felt this way. In fact, Vaughn would have some high-profile fans among Square Enix's own staff members, and for interesting reasons. One figure, Takashi Katano, who worked on the original game as the main system and event programmer before being named as the director of the Zodiac Age, named Vaughn as his favourite character amongst the cast. He cited that Vaughn was liked not only for his playable features, but his growing alongside the game's story, which was something he personally sympathised and connected with. Another key developer, Hiroyuki Kato, who also worked on the original game before returning to serve as producer on the Zodiac Age, would choose Vaughn as his favourite character for two different reasons. Kato said he sympathised with audiences, acknowledging that some fans do not feel as though Vaughn left an impression, but he loved Vaughn due to his role as a pure character who was filled with nothing but optimism and positivity. He also noted that without Vaughn, the entire cast would not have come together and become a team. Kato would also describe Kurahei Takeda, the motion capture and voice actor for Vaughn, as the second reason. Takeda was only in high school when he did his performance for Vaughn, and his depiction of the character would even influence some changes, as following his feedback, they made Vaughn less effeminate and more energetic and upbeat. Kato expressed that throughout the development process, they actually got to watch Takeda grow from a child to an adult through his performances of Vaughn, citing it as a memorable part of the process. The third person on the list to feature Vaughn as their favourite character would be Motomo Toriyama, who directed Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings. Toriyama acknowledged that Vaughn could be dense and counterproductive at times, but he admired Vaughn's enthusiasm and lively outlook at the beginning of his career as a sky pirate, feeling that he would end up having a bright future ahead of him. And that brings us on to our final and perhaps most intriguing fact, which relates to why Angela Aki became the vocalist for Kiss Me Goodbye. Throughout the early 2000s, Angela Aki was still a relatively unknown artist in Japan. She had produced music for several Japanese companies, but it wouldn't be until midway through 2005 that she would start to get noticed. This came through the release of an independent EP called One, which sold 9,000 copies and became the best-selling independent album of the year. Its success alerted Nobuo Uematsu to her talents, and he reached out to see if they could collaborate. But even though she did accept, it wasn't immediate. Aki shared details about their communication when she was performing at a special event in Shibuya hosted to celebrate the launch of Final Fantasy XII. She performed Kiss Me Goodbye, following it up with her own version of Eyes on Me from Final Fantasy VIII. Aki talked about her love for video games and music and shared that she had played Final Fantasy VII in the past, but her main motivation for accepting the role was actually her family, as she had numerous family members who were big fans of the franchise and encouraged her to sign the deal. Uematsu also revealed that outside of Aki's obvious talents, he also wanted to work with her because they were not only born in neighbouring regions of Japan, but because of the singer's playstyle of playing the keyboard whilst singing, something that reminded him of Elton John, an artist who he himself was inspired by. And with that, we're done. There were 7 more facts about Final Fantasy XII that were positive you still didn't know, although of course there will be some amongst you who already knew them all. Which one did you find to be the most intriguing though? Let us know in the comments, and if you enjoyed the video, please give us a like and hit that subscribe button. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Galcian Dikujata, Gregory and Lord of Morning, who are super special Onion Eye supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.